Let's talk about how React handles UI updates when a value changes. Over here on the app component, I have a counter component, which is nothing but a button that when clicked, it increases the count and should display the increased number of counts in the body of the button itself. So over here, I see the count. As I click on it, nothing is happening. So maybe this handler is not working. So let me go ahead and add a console log of count clicked and save. Let me go back, refresh. As I click on the count, we get this console log, but nothing is increasing in the counter still. All right, maybe the count here is really not working. So let me add another console log, and the current count is, and let's display what that number is. Refresh, try it again. As I'm clicking, I'm getting the increased number of counts. So obviously this is increasing. However, my UI is not updating. So to understand that, we have to talk about what React does behind the scenes to understand when it needs to update the UI and when does it not need to do that. React keeps a lightweight version of the DOM that we call the virtual DOM. And what it does is that it would only trigger updates to that virtual DOM when something called the state or when the props of a component gets updated. Anything other than that is just ignored by React altogether. So to convert this variable here into a state, which would cause our React component or our React application to re-render when that state changes, we'll use something called the useState hook. So I'm gonna import that from React, import useState from React. And down here, I will call useState with a default value of 0. Now, useState returns an array of 2 items. The first item is the value itself, and the second item is a function which updates the value of the state. So basically what we're doing here is an array destructuring. So here I'm going to have a counter and a function called setCounter. Now I can come back to this button and I'll have it actually use the value from counter, not from count. We'll leave that one for the time being. And down here, when we call the increase count, we're actually going to call setCounter and give it the new value of what it needs to be. So counter plus 1. Now let's see what happens. If I come back to my application, let's clear the console. As I'm clicking over, my counter is being updated. Why? Because now every time we are calling or clicking on this button, we're calling this function, which updates the state. And every time the state is called, we cause a re-render of our component altogether. Now notice when we're looking at the console logs coming over here, which is what's printing out the current count, which is the original value here, every time it comes back as 1. The reason why is that every time we re-render the component, this value here resets back to 0. And then basically all it does is that it adds 1 to 0. And that's why it comes back always as the number 1. If we were to add the counter value next to it, just so we can see them both together in the console log, and let me clear it out and refresh. Here we go. My initial value of the counter was 0, and then it became 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, while the value of the variable itself stays the same because every time we're re-rendering, we're refreshing this entire component or this entire function is being called all over again. What happens behind the scene also is that React takes the value of the state and it stores it somewhere else. So even though we are re-rendering or we're adding this component again to our screen, we're still retaining that same value of the state that we keep referencing. If you have React developer tools installed, you can go over here, and if you go under components, you'll see all the components that we have similar to the elements page, except that it understands that this is coming from a React component instead. And so if I click on the counter component here, you'll notice how it actually captures the value of my state right over here. Now, with that in mind, let me go ahead and clear out this count and clear out all of those consoles, but let's try something different. What if I actually duplicate this 3 times. What should I be expecting when I click on my count button here? Obviously, we're expecting it to become 3. But when I click on this, it stays as 1. Do it again, it's 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. So why is that happening? When we first loaded or mounted this component onto our screen, React replaced all of these calls here with the actual value of counter. So in this case, this was 0 plus 1, and then this here was 0 plus 1, and this here was also 0 plus 1. So regardless of how many times I call this one, I'm ending up with the same number, which is 1. However, if we actually want our mounted component to understand that these are a dynamic value that will keep updating, and if I call it 3 times, I want it to be called 3 times, we're going to have to pass a function instead of a value to our setCounter argument here. And to do that, what I'll do instead is basically say, give me the current value of my counter, and then I want you to return the current plus 1. So now if I call this 3 times and hit save, reload my application, click here, it increases it by 3, and then it becomes 6, 9, 12, so on and so forth. So now that we understand that, let's go ahead and apply it to our to-do application, and we'll do that in the next video.